Our next two speakers are going to be Dr. Konstantinos Dagianis and Andreas Traum from PwC. One of them is here. I welcome Andreas Traum, and one of them will be online. The topic will be hurdles of institutional adoption of DeFi, so we can directly continue from Magnus' presentation here, I believe. Okay, and I see everyone is here, so stage is yours.
I was going to ask whether that's going to work. Fantastic. Thanks.
There's your microphone.
Thank you. So today, well, first of all, I learned that next year we need to see how the order of sequences so that we don't speak directly after EY. And I just learned that I need to look at my own watch so to see if we have any questions afterwards that we can answer. On the positive note, though, I think we just heard a lot about the future of DeFi from a true DeFi enthusiast, and we're going to take you back into a little bit looking at some of the hurdles that we see for adopting them. But with that, and in a true virtual fashion, let me pass over to Konstantinos.
Hello, everybody. Do you hear me? Andreas, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we do.
Okay,
yeah,
perfect. So just a quick intro from my side. My name is Konstantin, and I'm a partner in PwC at the financial services practice, and I lead the crypto assurance practice here in Germany. I mostly consult crypto companies as new players in the financial market, potential business model, and new use cases to establish financial service providers, and of course, a regulatory part in handling crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and tokenization of traditional assets. And I'm really happy to talk to you about DeFi today with Andreas. And maybe Andreas, a short intro from your side as well.
My name, partner in our financial services consulting practice, and together with Konstantin, coordinate what we do across our lines of services for the digital asset crypto space. So across our assurance, where we actually have the first blockchain and crypto audit engagements, obviously consulting, and our tax and legal practice. Also part of our global blockchain and crypto network, where I think we have a lot of people led out of Hong Kong, where we do a lot of government work in crypto. So we're basically supporting crypto and the adoption of digital assets across the world. Very happy to speak to you today.
Yeah, maybe we can jump to the next slide. Thanks. So the DeFi has evolved incredibly quickly in the past years. So as you see, compared to 2020, we have a growth of 400%. Right now, the total value locked on Ethereum is $80 billion in the DeFi sector. But the market is still very young and unexperienced in a very early stage of the development. You can see that already in finding out how big the total value locked is. You find many different sources in the internet with different numbers. So it's early stage. DeFi is far from being widely adopted. The user's interface of crypto wallets like MetaMask is not yet intuitive enough. And interacting with DeFi application can also be very complicated. On the top of that, Ethereum has become unusable for most users with small wallets, as the transaction costs for using DeFi services are extremely high. Since it's still very young, the infrastructure, the smart contract will stay many risks are not addressed yet. DeFi projects are regularly in the news because of exploits, hacks, where funds were stolen and just gone. Additional to that, regulators in the EU and the US are looking into DeFi and trying to find a way to define standards to address the risk of money laundering and cybersecurity. I think the DeFi protocol must work on delivering more user-friendly services to reach mass adoption, but at the same time, develop their internal control frameworks to address the risks appropriately and stop being in the weekly news. We see a major interest from financial institutions in the market. They are trying to find their role and their right to play in that completely new decentralized ecosystem. Of course, there is a fear of competition, since DeFi delivers almost all the services a traditional bank does. Andreas is going to analyze and compare the two worlds later. Additional to that, traditional services, there are many more. Just want to mention, one of the most fast and growing currently DeFi sector is gaming and DeFi. The GameFi is a very broad term that basically stands for combination of gaming, NFTs, and DeFi. There are already some games like Axie Infinity, which you probably heard a lot in the last month. There was a huge hack with almost 600 million were lost. As more and more play-to-earn games are launched in 2022, I think the interaction between DeFi and NFT can be expected in very high in the increase. On that note, I would like to jump to the next slide and bring the acronym, a new acronym in the game. So usually DeFis are organized in DAOs, so decentralized autonomous organizations. That's another very big change in how to run a business. There are no traditional roles. It's basically a digital company without a manager, with rules of procedures that are difficult to change. It needs a huge mindset and mentality shift, because for every major decision must be voted in the community. So it's a major shift here. The ideas in decentralization, no one decides on their own. The organization belongs to the community. Intermediaries, institutions such as banks, brokers are replaced by predefined conditions, secured in automatically running smart contracts. We have a lot of discussion with the old economy, how they can participate in such an innovative and disruptive new business model. And I can tell you, there are a couple of players who are working on getting a part of that whole new game. But let's take a look into the differences between the old and new economy world. Andreas.
Thanks, Konstantin. So if we look at the financial market infrastructure, and I've been working in the industry ever since leaving high school myself, working for the first electronic trading system, getting that with a transparent order book, so that was digitalization already in the 90s. If we look at the key players in those two industries, they are very much the same on the surface. So we have in the traditional financial market infrastructure, we have stock exchanges. In the DeFi space, we have the decentralized exchanges, we have digital exchanges. Looking at banks playing a fundamental role in the traditional financial infrastructure, looking at offers of DeFi lending and borrowing. Now, we have seen, and Konstantin mentioned this before, I think a lot of what you're hearing today and tomorrow is also about the two worlds converging. So like we just had a very traditional banking house, Von der Heydt, trying to join up with a digital exchange, BitMEX in this case, and we're also seeing some of the hurdles that are in the way of some of these transactions. And a lot of that has to do with some of the topics we'll discuss later in this presentation, which are around adopting the German and European legislation and regulatory scheme onto decentralized exchanges. Going on, we have obviously the classic issuers opposed to DeFi token issuers, or also issuers of security token offerings. Now, what we saw in the initial aftermath, the first dip of COVID, we saw a fundamental increase in prime bond issuance in the traditional markets, but also for the first time, 2 years ago, we saw a very high portion of that being funded through security tokens. So also, we're seeing how new players are emerging and are entering the classical financial world. Very interesting concept. We look at portfolio managers and the DeFi asset managers. So we look at what Konstantin mentioned, the DAO. Typically in the DeFi world, a pure DeFi fund would be a fantastic DAO. No central management, no central authority. That's going to be very interesting to see how that will ever comply with the CAC22A in Germany. And we just had some recent movements by the European Parliament that also go against that. Lastly, and not often mentioned when we look at DeFi insurance, think very clear what we're talking about when we mention insurance in the classic infrastructure. DeFi insurance, as I recently read, a nascent industry within a nascent industry. So looking at some of the damages, looking at estimated 10 billion of damages last year within DeFi infrastructures, we have an emerging industry now to offer insurance against those losses. That's on the surface. So we have very much the same players. If we look underneath the surface, obviously we have a lot of differences. And just looking at time, I'll be a bit quicker on those. But very much on the organization perspective, I think it's very clear. We have traditional companies, especially in the investment or in the banking infrastructure. We have very hierarchical, very well regulated traditional companies, and BaFin or other regulators are very keen on understanding what we in German love to call the schriftlich fixierte Ordnung, looking at the governance structures, looking at all of the policies. All of that has to be very well structured, very well documented, and put in place. And what we've also seen in the last few years is a lot of scrutiny by regulators in on-site inspections, looking especially at neo-brokers, making sure that the governance that's in place is in line with the growing size of their business. If we're looking at custody, in CeFi, we're very traditional custodians. In Germany, we have the Depotbanken. In the DeFi world, we're talking about self-custody. And if we look at the recent decision last week, some hurdles that the regulators want to impose on non-hosted wallets and bring a lot of the KYC requirements into that. On the technology side, on the DeFi side, very much open source software. Looking at security, very by now over the years, and everything that happened in the financial crisis, very secure environment within the traditional centralized finance world, very much a bit trial by luck. If you look at which DAO, which DeFi infrastructure that you want to invest or do business with. I think we mentioned others, management, very clear regulation. So far, largely unregulated. We'll see, and Magnus also mentioned a bit about that. We'll see what happens within the next years. But we're going to see a lot of regulation being imposed on the DeFi world. Obviously, direct fiat connection advantage still in the centralized world. That's a bridge that we still need to gap when looking at DeFi infrastructures. On the positive side for DeFis, we don't have human manipulation, at least not manual human manipulation, and we're looking at 100% automation. Now, looking at some of those differences, Konstantin, what do you think are some of the most prominent challenges that we have for bringing DeFi into our traditional institutional marketplaces?
So yeah, I think the most common is like the transactional costs, because we still, if we use Ethereum, as I already mentioned, it is really an issue that at least for the small wallets, that the transactional price are pretty high. And if I compare it to Visa and to the other traditional transaction services, it's still not acceptable. So they got to work on that. But there are a lot of projects with side chains, with new chains, where the transaction costs are much more convenient, and it's much getting better. But still, it's a new type of market. So I think another huge issue is the liquidity, and through a lot of hacks happened in the last years, and the EU Parliament discussing in that direction. I think liquidity will get a huger issue, because the market really, to build a DeFi system, really needs a lot of liquidity, so the different trades can really get fulfilled, the different trading pairs are on the decentralized exchanges and so on. Right now, most of the DeFi projects try really to get liquidity through very attractive returns for early users. That's of course the easiest way to launch a DeFi platform, but it's also the most unsustainable. It's important to have a sustainable DeFi model with reasonable incentives to stay long-term in the business. Right now we have around about 150 projects in the DeFi sector, and they lack of liquidity, most of them, but I think a good solution would be a central liquidity pool for all the platforms, but that has to be cross-chaining, which is again a huge risk. Like I jump into the interpolability. If you use different chains and having different transactions over chains, so you do multi-chaining or bridging, then you of course have a new cybersecurity risk, because if you use only one blockchain and do all the transactions and it's a closed shop basically, then the risk is lower because the programming language is the same and you don't have so many interfaces. But through these interfaces, of course, it's a new thing. It's of course a new risk arising there. So it's a good thing, but still you have to implement very good controls. So basically the interoperability, which is basically the solution for DeFi, can be managed better. And I think with that note, I would like to jump to DeFi and regulation, Andreas, and maybe you can talk to that a little bit.
Sure, thanks. And I think some of the concepts that you mentioned, the creation of liquidity pools, we actually want to do that. That's already where we see some of the obstacles, because that's one of the key points we still see, or one of the big challenges, is how to combine the regulatory scheme that we have in Germany and within the EU with the requirements and the fantasy and the ideas that's behind DeFi. So you mentioned liquidity pools. If I just look at the German investment code and say, oh, let's pool our liquidities, it's very quick to find out that I'm within the remit of the investment code. And the regulators want to see a fund manager in that role, and they want to have the fund manager separated from the actual custodian. That doesn't work in a DeFi world. So that's one of the, looking at the licensing requirements under the German banking supervision law, that's one of the big challenges. Also, if we look at the, the management requirements for the managing directors of let me call it a DeFi institute, if you can even call that. In true essence, DeFi doesn't have an institute. But how do you apply those supervisions? If I go through each of the main articles of the investment code, and I look at the principle of DeFi next to that, next to everyone, there's a big question mark, and say, how are we going to make those two worlds comply? I think that's also the lack of clear regulation for DeFi is also, of course, a threat to common acceptance. We heard just before that the number of true DeFi wallets is still small. I mean, we're looking at $255 billion worth of transactions just last year, but that's still small in scale compared to the overall digital assets in crypto, and not to mention the traditional centralized finance. And that's one of the main hurdles to adoption of that. I think also we look at FATF, as mentioned before, if we look at also the funds transfer regulation, the current draft that was passed by the EU Parliament for that, we're going to be seeing a lot of requirements on KYC processes. And if you're in corporate banking and you know how much of a pain KYC has been for traditional financial world, where you can actually, it's easy to identify who is the counterpart. If we look at imposing those same strict regulations on DeFi, that's going to be one of the big hurdles. But also maybe one of the challenges is going to be interesting to see how we can tackle that. At PwC, we're actually looking into how we can offer trust services that would enable the holder of a decentralized wallet to be able to comply with those. I think that's somewhere I'm getting a very strong signal. And the other lesson is I should stop my stopwatch when I start speaking, which I didn't do today. So I think in a nutshell, very, very interesting concepts and a lot of enthusiasm. And I think that DeFi definitely is the future of finance. But as we're seeing, and as just proven last week, there's still a lot of hurdles that we need to overcome in order to enable the institutional adoption. And we didn't put up all of the services that we can do, but if you have any questions, if you need any support, feel free to contact Konstantinos or myself. And now, do we have time for questions?